Thank you. Thanks all the participants for waking up bright and early on Thursday to tune into this conversation. And thank you so much, Tom and Justin, for coming out to lend your time and expertise to this. I think is a very important conversation that needs to be had. So hi everyone, my name is Avery. I'm a lawyer who works at the John Howard Society of Ontario, where I work on advocacy campaigns to help break down the stigma of a criminal record. And I also have a second hat as director of the Law and Design Collab, which is a nonprofit that brings creative professionals and connects them with justice advocates to try to make some of these campaigns and arguments more compelling to a general audience. Right, so today, this event is part of Access to Justice Week, which is a series of events at the Law Society of Ontario. So some people may have just seen this on Eventbrite, whereas a few, I think, probably signed up through the Law Society. I'd encourage you to check out, we have a couple more events. So tomorrow at noon and at 3 p.m., we're having panels on breaking down the stigma of a criminal record, and also why be optimistic about bail reform in Ontario. All of these are, difficult subjects. So, I can't promise any real optimism coming out of them. But for today, the goal of the conversation is to think about the ways in which the legal profession could better support journalists in doing the essential work that they do. And I'm so glad that we have some of the leading voices covering the criminal justice sector to join us. So the way that the conversation is going to go is we'll start by having Tom and Justin speak to their work for about 5 to 7 minutes. Hopefully Alicia can join us, and then have her blurb. And then I'll do a little bit of moderated conversation to touch on some of the themes that you'll see on the Eventbrite. So things like, sorry, my brain's just blanking there. I will put up here. Things on the Eventbrite, for example, like solutions-based, not just a kind of very overwhelmingly negative coverage. How do we talk about, practical solutions, providing greater context? Oftentimes in popular entertainment and kind of 24-hour news, you're going to get very, short, disconnected stories, whereas with beat reporting and investigative journalism, you can kind of hold a lens to the issue to actually understand it a bit better. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So Tom, I believe you're up first.
Yeah, have at it. Should I just jump into it?
Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah.
Cool. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm an investigative reporter at the Globe and Mail. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit today. Well, we're going to talk about many things, but perhaps the most relevant work that I've done that touches on this field is an investigation that we began publishing last year. And I say began because I'm not done yet. I would like to keep digging on systemic bias in federal prison risk assessments, which is an extremely arcane topic, to be fair, but one that I learned during the almost 2 years that I spent slowly digging into this, which is sometimes how long it takes, and I'm sure Justin will know what I'm talking about there. Slowly unraveled a very complex, but also extremely simple system that has an enormous impact on the lives of basically every single person who goes through the federal prison service. So, very quickly, I think when we're talking about federal prison, it's important to consider the fact that there is a massive over-incarceration problem in Canada, setting aside even the provincial system, which I'm sure a lot of the attendees today are familiar with and the people watching are familiar with, and the problems with, remand in Ontario and whatever else. If we're talking only federally, so these are only people that that are sentenced to a term of 2 years or longer. In federal prison, Indigenous people are extremely overrepresented. So they account for roughly 5% of the population in this country. And yet they account for more than 30%, close to basically a third now of the federally incarcerated population. So an enormous disconnect there. And similarly with Black people account for something like 3.5% of the Canadian population, but as the Office of the Correctional Investigator has made clear in the last couple of years, they're making up close to 10% of the federally incarcerated population. So there are these enormous disconnects for racialized people in prison. And I wanted to dig into why that discrepancy was not only occurring, but increasing. It's been getting only worse for years and years and years now. And eventually, in my work, I honed in on the use of risk assessments, something that a lot of criminal lawyers are probably familiar with. They've probably experienced these when they're dealing with things like pre-sentence reports or whatever else. They do get used in other contexts as well. Say you're trying to determine whether someone has ADHD or whether they're, oh God, I don't know, how well they're able to adjust to life on their own or whatever. Risk assessments get used in a whole variety of contexts, and it's no different in prison. So the Federal Prison Service has these risk scores that they've developed over decades. Some of them date back to the 80s that determine everything about a person's time inside. So they'll be assigned a security rating, minimum, medium, maximum, based on these scores. They'll be assigned a reintegration potential score that says, oh, this person is low, medium, or high reintegration potential, and that'll have a huge impact on parole. Security rating will have an impact on treatments, on their prison placement, which is an enormous factor when you're being federally incarcerated. And so my work very briefly looked at the racial discrepancies in these scores, and I tried to account for as many factors as possible: criminal history, age, gender, whether the level of severity for the offense that landed them in prison in the first place, all these kinds of things. And what I found was that at admission, Black men were roughly 24% more likely than white men to end up in maximum security, the worst possible security rating. Indigenous men, meanwhile, were roughly 30% more likely to end up with the worst possible reintegration score at any point during their sentence. This is compared to white men. So just enormous discrepancies. And further to that, they're both less likely to reoffend than their white peers after accounting for their reintegration scores. And later stories showed that these numbers were even worse for women, for Indigenous women. So, risk scores, these enormously important tools in the correctional system and in the criminal justice system, and yet also perpetuating systemic bias in prison and the systemic inequalities that we see to this day. Since that story, so that's all of this, that's all of the, as you were talking about just now, Avery, that's all of the sad and difficult stuff to talk about. So thinking of solutions and talking about the future, since that story has come out, there's been the announcement of a parliamentary study, though it remains to be seen if Parliament will take that back up since the election. The study has been announced, or the reporting has been acknowledged by then Public Safety Minister Bill Blair and by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself when it first came out, and a class action lawsuit has been launched on behalf of tens of thousands of prisoners. So, if we want to talk about impact, here's an example of a story that does have a potential for impact, right? And a potential to actually change the system for the better through journalism. I'll stop my spiel there.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that. And that's an amazing series of articles. I'd encourage everyone to get on the Globe and Mail to check that out. And I think some of the themes that we'll return to that Tom has brought up is, how did Tom get access to that data, right? So what is the freedom of information regime? How is that posing a significant barrier to accountability and reporting? So we'll touch on some of those themes in the conversation. Okay, Justin, I'll hand it over to you. Justin is a prolific writer on, there's Alicia. Awesome. A prolific writer on the criminal justice system and has some amazing articles out. So Justin, if you just kind of give people a little tour of your work and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So for basically my entire career, I have found myself covering the criminal justice system, which was not by design, I think more by accident than anything. But for nearly a decade now, I've been writing for the Canadian Bar Association's national magazine, and I found myself focusing on everything from criminal justice reform to the ways in which the criminal justice system is failing many of those who go through it, to the over-incarceration rate that Tom talked about and does some great coverage on. And about, in many cases, some of the more kind of smaller aspects of the criminal justice system that can actually lead to kind of large and systemic inequities. I've also spent a ton of time covering criminal trials sort of day to day, as well as some of the more complicated and difficult ones. I have dealt with the court system straight across the country at this point. I spent a better part of 2018 covering the Bruce McArthur case in Toronto, obviously one of the worst serial killer cases we've had in this country. And I've spent much of 2020 covering the abhorrent situation in our federal prisons, to some degree provincial prisons as well, and looking at the impact that COVID-19 has had on our incarcerated population, and kind of the woeful insufficient response taken by the government of Canada and correctional services to sort of mitigate that risk. So I've kind of covered every different corner you can sort of think of the criminal justice system. And I think we'll probably get into a lot of this stuff in more detail as we kind of go through some of the specifics. But I think there's a lot of different issues that are crashing together right now in a way that is really, I think, worrying, troubling, and just desperately undercovered and not talked about enough on the national stage. As Tom has noted, we've seen what the correctional investigator calls an indigenization of our federal prison system. We have seen just some of the worst outcomes from that prison system in the last number of years, from a massive spike in overdose deaths to a recidivism rate that just seems to be completely decoupled from any strategies we're currently undergoing, to the proliferation of what is essentially slave labor in many of those prisons that is actually costing the government money. We're seeing just systemic abuse and over-reliance on solitary confinement, even after it was declared unconstitutional at the Supreme Court. Or accepted as unconstitutional at the Supreme Court at the very least. We've seen a continued over-reliance on charging even for simple drug offenses that we claim to be moving away from. And we're also seeing just a increasing reality of the court system and the prison system turning into a black box. We're seeing a complete dismantling of the access to information system, which is making it harder and harder for journalists and researchers to get basic information about how our prison system or our justice system is working. We're seeing, basically an overworking of everyone who handles access to information, as well as just basic record requests in our court system, which is just creating a complete opaqueness as to how the justice system is working. And more broadly, we're seeing a complete indifference to a lot of these problems at the national and the provincial level. The federal government has basically tried to explain away a lot of these problems in the last number of years. We've seen milquetoast and middling efforts to reform some of these problems, in some cases changes that actually make things worse. We've seen a little bit of movement just in the last year and a half or so, but movement that still wildly mismatches the severity of the problem. And I think you're going to see all these things continue to create a negative feedback loop and make things worse and worse and worse until actual concrete action is taken. And to do that, I think we're going to have to keep kind of underscoring these problems at the national level. And like I said, that's becoming harder and harder. So happy to be here. Happy we're at least kind of starting to engage in some of these questions, even if it's a little depressing. Even if maybe there's not so much reason to be optimistic, maybe starting this conversation can start the ball rolling and help us tackle some of these problems in a more fundamental way. And with that, I will stop being depressing.
ray of sunshine on a Thursday morning.
I also don't think you're going to stop being depressing throughout the day.
No, I'm not.
Don't
I'm
promise.
not.
Going to get to the deep end today.
It's gonna get worse.
Thank you, Justin, providing that really great overview. And I guess just to kind of point out some of the themes that we're going to cover, in the moderated conversation, what the potential is of journalism to bring this issue to national attention. I think, people have used the word reckoning. I feel like it's kind of overused and kind of lost its meaning. I feel like there is more attention being paid to the criminal justice system right now. Based on what Justin said, that is not necessarily, it's not enough, clearly not enough. And I think there's a lot of potential in Canada for this to grow. And I feel like the legal profession is a natural ally to journalists, and there are ways that we could be doing a much better job of supporting their essential work. Because as the kind of the pitch for this event, law reform is not. There is no real reason to believe that more law reform is going to happen or work unless there's really significant public support behind it. Okay, and with that, let's move on to Alicia. She's going to speak about her work. She's a beat reporter on the justice scene in Toronto, and has really done a lot of amazing coverage of some of these very systemic problems.
Yeah, so I'm a courts reporter for the Toronto Star, which just started off when I started. It was mostly about going to court and covering trials, and that quickly turned into like, oh wow, this is like the system that we have. Like, this seems like a problem. And there are so many issues that when you're going to court every day, it becomes very quickly apparent to you that there is a lot that is not working. And I think people have like ideas about the criminal justice system, which are not like, obviously, I think not founded in reality. They're not founded from like experience. And people who have experience with the criminal justice system will understand better, but still maybe don't have like the full broad picture of like where we're at, because your experience with the criminal justice system is like, it's based on the amount of money that you have, the kind of lawyer that you have, the amount of access to supports and services and like family support. And like, so your experience in the criminal justice system is also like very, very specific. And the more universal experience is like just really harsh and negative, I would say. But like, it just really varies. And so the beat then sort of really began to expand into like, why are we doing things this way? What are some of the problems that are coming up? You start to see like the kinds of people, like when I often, one of the worst parts of my job is when I have to go to like first appearances when someone's just arrested. And then you have to like rush to court in the morning and figure out where a person's going to be. And that means you end up sitting in like first appearance court or bail court for like the whole day. And when you're doing that, you're watching all of these other people come through the court while you're waiting for the person that you're there for. And you start to see who's coming to court and how they're coming to court and why they're coming to court. And it's like, these people aren't coming here because of necessarily crimes they've committed. They're coming here because of social failures or preventable things, other problems. And unless you're solving those problems, those people are not going to stop coming back to court. And we're not fixing them by bringing them into court. We're not fixing and when I say fixing, I mean like helping people's lives get better in a way that they're not like being forced to come into court and go through the criminal justice system and get criminal records that like for really minor things that will like ruin the rest of their lives. Often those people have mental health issues, sometimes severe, sometimes less severe, sometimes and very commonly coupled with drug use and other things that can exacerbate those issues. And it can feel really hopeless to sit there and like watch all of this stuff happen. And just, Justin talked about the recidivism rate, and, there are concepts around rehabilitation are really confusing and ineffective. And unhelpful, and it's only gotten worse during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, my beat really expanded in a way that it hadn't before. I had written about jail and prison conditions before, but then the pandemic really brought that into real clear focus. We knew about all of these issues, and then they all just got worse. Whatever programming was happening stopped happening. Whatever interactions people were having with the outside world stopped happening. You know, the phone system that was already a problem before just spun out into this like much worse problem. And like giving someone like a, you know, half an hour in a video chat is not going to fix that. It's not going to fix like human contact. And so, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions. The other part of this I'll just talk about is there's a lot of misconceptions about the justice system. Like I said in the beginning, I didn't understand a lot about it when I started doing this beat, even though I thought I was a pretty well-informed person. And the other large part of my job is explaining to people how this works. How does our bail system work? Because if you can't understand how that works, then you can't advocate for change. You can't point out to specific like Canadian issues. You can't look at like what's going on when the police are saying, oh, this person was out on bail when they committed another crime, to like understand what that even means. People don't understand how our system works. They don't understand how our sentencing principles work. They don't understand all those things. And so a large part of my job is just trying to explain like how the system functions as it is now so that we can talk about reform in a meaningful way. So I think that kind of covers it for now.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. And okay, so now we're gonna jump into the moderated conversation portion. There is a Q&A feature on Zoom. So what I would suggest is if you have questions come up, please type them in there. And as we kind of hit the 20 to 30 minute mark, we'll switch to audience questions. And also the panelists can read the questions that you write too, so they can, you know, in their remarks, address some of the points the questions that you may have. And I also wanted to point out that we have 50 online participants on a bright and early Thursday morning, which is amazing. So I'm really glad that all of you have come out and consider this important enough for your time. Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. So after kind of understanding the scope of work of Tom, Justin, and Alicia, I titled this talk, Advancing the Public Dialogue. Okay, so what does that really mean? I think, you know, building on Alicia's point, there's like a real problem with the public dialogue in Canada because, you know, there's this basic issue of media literacy. Like, do people even know, do they even have a basic orientation to what's happening? And I'll point to a couple of phenomena. So one is kind of like the political football of the criminal justice sector, right? Like in the Harper years, we had quite regressive, tough on crime, also dumb on crime policies. And as Justin adverted to, in the Liberal majority and minority years, extreme disappointment from criminal justice advocates in what the government actually did, despite their promises. So I think there's a big question here, and we're going to turn it back to the panelists. What do we do to actually provide some media literacy? Like, you know, Justin writes freelance and you know, with the CBA and with Maclean's and other great publications, Tom at the Globe and Mail, Alicia at the Toronto Star. You know, what are the opportunities that you see, you know, that where media literacy and basic literacy could be enhanced?
Here, I'll jump in. You know, I don't know that it's an issue of literacy, to be totally honest. I think I don't even think it's a question of interest. You know, in my experience, not everything I write about the criminal justice system elicits much interest from the general public. Some stuff is naturally, just by virtue of the fact that it is wonky, is not going to be you know, not going to catch the interest of the average reader. But a lot of the stuff I have written about, I think actually has connected with a lot of everyday folks who maybe don't understand all the intricacies of these problems, or at the very least want to know more about you know, the details of how our justice system is working or not working. The problem, I think, that is really at the core of this, you know, why is change not happening? Why is there not a more of a political constituency for this? I think it's because everyone feels like this is an intractable problem, right? I think people are so sort of depressed about sorry, you can hear my dog kicking herself on the bed. But you know, I think a lot of people feel like this is never going to change. There's nothing we can do to fix this. That you know, there is really no progress to be made. You know, I've spoken to people inside the Liberal government. I've spoken to people who have worked for the former Conservative government, and the attitude is that you get more votes and more political support by doing a bad job effectively. You do better politically when you are torturing inmates. You know, you do better politically when you are throwing people in jail, even if it's not effective, cost-effective, effective in terms of public safety, effective in terms of rehabilitation. Canadians love to talk about how much they believe in a rehabilitative justice system, but in effect, they want to vote for something that is punitive, needlessly harsh, and performatively harsh in a bunch of ways. At least this is the attitude amongst the politicians who I speak to. And that's, you know, that's really depressing. And I don't 100% know how you short circuit that. There is no political party in Canada that talks about justice reform in a top to bottom way. The Green Party and the NDP have historically been there, but actually in recent years have pared away those aspects of their platform to basically reflect the milquetoast, centrist, ineffective status quo policy. You know, you go back historically, there's actually been constituencies in all parties that have supported smart criminal justice reform. Even the Reform Party actually had a constituency within it that advocated for prison and justice reform with an eye to actually arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating fewer people, especially for nonviolent crimes, in some part at least, to reduce the overall cost of the justice system, which is a massive, you know, $3 billion, $4 billion line item on our federal ledger. But that has gone away. That has largely dissipated in recent years, and you really have a sort of consensus position from all parties that the status quo is more or less working. And it's really depressing. And I really think the way you short circuit that is by kind of drawing a line under the failures on every front and hoping that the public starts demanding better, hoping that someone in the political realm actually decides to stand up for effective policy instead of, you know, completely superficial politicking.
Just to add to that, a concrete example of what Justin's talking about in terms of, you know, the political will. I spoke with Jody Wilson-Raybould last year about this topic, about, you know, reform. You know, what's going on? Like, why haven't we seen the reform that we were told was going to occur in 2015? And she told me, you know, straight up that it was communicated to her very quickly when she became Attorney General and Minister of Justice that, you know, criminal justice reform was seen as a red meat issue, and there was just going to be no political runway to do it. And, you know, she went into that role hoping to do things like eliminate mandatory minimum penalties, overhaul aspects of the sentencing regime in this country. And by and large, you know, virtually everything that she'd planned failed to materialize on that front. The modifications that did occur under the Liberals were very minor in their first term. And, you know, it's a sore point for a lot of people who have been pushing for reform for a very long time to this day. And I think it's interesting to note too that, you know, we talk about reform, and I think, you know, to a lay audience, they might think, well, we don't know what reform is supposed to look like. But the truth is that, you know, all of the reports have been written. You know, there are sentencing reports. There was a commission on sentencing with, you know, a blue ribbon panel of judges in the 1980s that you could basically take that document, move it in time to today, and it would still apply, right? And the same thing goes for remand. We could talk about the remand problem for 2 hours right now if we all wanted to, we already have all the reports that tell us what needs to happen. Same thing goes for the federal prison system and the, you know, gazillion issues that Justin mentioned in his brief talk, or the access problems in court that Alicia's talking about. We have a list of solutions kind of at the ready, and you know, I kind of get tired sometimes writing stories about policing or about prisons or about the courts, because it feels like I'm shouting into the void a little bit when I'm saying, okay, well, here's the solution again. You know, here's the story, here's the problem, and in the same story, I try to present here's the solution in case, you know, someone in a position of power is reading that story and says, oh, you know, I didn't realize there was a solution to this. But you know, it kind of makes me think that that our role should really be one of packaging these proposed solutions or these ideas from, you know, be it policymakers, judges, lawyers, activists, whatever, and presenting it to the public so they understand that, you know, these are not intractable problems. We don't have to let people rot in a systemically racist system unnecessarily.
Just briefly, I don't mean to cut off Alicia, but I just wanted to mention, you know, you talk about Jody Wilson-Raybould. I've had similar conversations with her about exactly this. But one thing that really frustrates me is that, you know, I hear her when she says, I really wanted to come in and do this reform package. I really wanted to come in and eliminate mandatory minimums. She's told me she actually advocated for full drug decriminalization, the full elimination of criminal penalties for possession, which is great stuff. The problem is the bill she introduced, C-75, which was heralded by the Liberal Party as a justice reform bill, actually made things worse. And you talk about media literacy. The media barely reported on the bill to begin with. When they did, they actually did talk about it. They actually did use the Liberals' lines that it was reform, that it was actually alleviating sentencing, when in fact, it hybridized a list of criminal penalties that actually, on the whole, increased the total available penalties and sentencing for a raft of nonviolent offenses that in the end actually will probably worsen the over-incarceration problem. And the fact that was so rarely actually pointed out by the media actually underscores that part of the literacy problem is in the media. The media does not have a literacy for criminal justice issues. And more often than not, they don't bother to try to correct that. And more often than not, editors don't seem interested in actually getting to the heart of the matter because they do not believe their readers care about these issues and don't feel the need to cater to them.
Yeah, and to be clear, you know, I'm not trying to excuse it. But it is, I agree. I mean, talking to colleagues either at the Globe or elsewhere, sometimes you do realize, oh wow, there is a real lack of knowledge of how the system works. But I feel like Alicia has a lot more experience than I do, so I'll shut up.
I agree with everything you guys said, especially what Justin just said around like media, like the media literacy problem being like, do journalists understand enough about this area to like understand the impacts of these things and ask the right questions and push on the right points. But I feel like, you know, Tom talked about the many reports and many commissions and like all the smart people that have like spent their lives crafting solutions to these things only for them not to happen. But I still feel like there's this weird, and we've all written about like all the terrible things that are happening in these systems. And, you know, people read those stories, they do, but I still feel like there's a huge area of people who like are just very happy to not engage with this because it's not like in their face. And like part of the reason we're seeing so much movement, I think, in discussions around the opioid crisis, because I think it is in people's faces now in a way that it wasn't before. And in part of that is because there was a long failure to like address those kinds of issues and report about those issues. And in part because it's such a huge crisis now. We've let it get to like an unbelievable point. But I think with justice reform, it's really hard for people to like be confronted with it in a long-term and meaningful way. And it's just very easy for people to like go, okay, well, I'm not going to learn what a mandatory minimum is and like how it, leads to like young people being incarcerated and like ending up in like a situation where they're only ever going to be in prison in a really unfair and racist way. And that's where I like struggle, because we do write these stories and we talk about these issues and we like, try and talk to politicians. We talk to, and like, I guess that's what frustrates me is like, how many stories do you have to write about this to like, will they make a difference? And I don't know, on a good day, it's like very optimistic. On a bad day, it's like really hopeless. Because I don't know the information is all out there. We're just saying the same thing over and over again, I guess.
This is, that's a great point that I feel like each of you has elaborated on and provided a really great perspective on. And then, I mean, like speaking to the legal professional audience, which is quite a few of our participants today, I think in the legal profession, you know, I don't practice in the criminal justice space. I'm more on the advocacy side, but our main responses are always write a report, make a plan, write a report. And I feel like there needs to be a real change in basically an acceptance of this fact. Like the answers are already there. There is an amazing set of academia and researchers that have very well studied and diagnosed many, if not most, of all of the problems in our criminal justice system. It's really a matter of, you know, activating people and making this information more accessible. And I think that's one of those things is a resourcing issue. So looking to the US, of course, you know, a very different, in some ways, a very different system, but also in some ways kind of similar. The investment in reporting in the US, and this may you know, come as news to some of the audience who doesn't follow a lot of US media, but organizations like the Marshall Project or the Vera Institute, these are like outlets that are dedicated on criminal justice reform. And I feel like that's just not what's happening in Canada. You know, we have today with us, you know, people from the leading publications in Canada, and you know, there is an issue of not investing enough in this type of reporting. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing I just want to pose to the panelists now is, in what ways could the legal profession be doing more? So this might have to do with, you know, access to information, maybe in actually advocating to get more resources to journalists. You know, based on what you've experienced and I guess what you've seen in other countries like the US, what do you see as kind of the ways that the legal profession could support you?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here because well, I think this fire burns bright in all of us, but I think that there's a fundamental issue of access in this country that really, head nods, it really blocks our ability to report on the justice system and to, you know, find the people who can propose the reforms or changes that are necessary. I mean, setting aside the question of, you know, how do we, the media, communicate those things to people, and how do we get people to actually engage with those questions on an issue, especially politically, setting all of that aside for a second, there's a massive problem in terms of access to information in this country. Justin mentioned, you know, access to information laws. Courts, interestingly enough, are almost in virtually every province, for the most part, they're carved out of access to information legislation. So that's not even a point of consideration. You know, I use access to information legislation all the time, federally and provincially. I have probably upwards of 24 pending requests with CSC right now, all of which are delayed in some form or far overdue. But even within the courts, I think one of the most distressing themes of the last several years has been move towards, you know, less disclosure from the courts, or the courts forcing us to jump through hoops unnecessarily to access documents that are in the public record to begin with. In August, we had to apply to a judge in Saskatchewan to access publicly available court files in a case between the federal government and the Catholic Church. And we had to, you know, that cost us money, which is fine. We're happy to pay that, but we should have never had to do that. These are public records. The Star goes to court all the time to file for the disclosure of routine records that should be handed over as a matter of fact. I think that the access issue creates this enormous gap in our knowledge about the goings on in, you know, the courts in this country and the criminal justice system, in part because, you know, lawyers operating in the criminal system, or even judges, they're doing everything from a kind of bottom-up approach, right? They only see what's going on right in front of them, and rightfully so. I mean, that's their job. It's to deal with, you know, my client is to, you know, assess this person's ability to, you know, reintegrate or whatever. and to, all the things that go with that. Whereas we are kind of taking the 10,000 feet up view, right? We're trying to say, okay, what's happening? What are the trends that are occurring? What are the issues that are arising? And it's becoming increasingly difficult to track those things and to keep an eye on them. And this is something that I am especially frustrated with, because it's not, us as journalists don't have any special rights, really. We're just we're just citizens, we're part of the public. So if we're the ones suffering with this, you can only imagine what a normal person who, walks around, does whatever, and then walks into a courthouse and requests a document, what they're going to face, what they're going to experience. Everyone should be able to access this stuff. And as that access has eroded, and the willingness of lawyers, judges, clerks to, work with us on those kinds of requests has eroded, it's really hurt our ability to continue to report on this, which I think is partly why there's a smattering of people doing the kind of work that Justin, Alicia, and I do, because it's just so difficult and it requires so much insider knowledge and so many connections and so much effort unnecessarily. In the States, it's very easy to access court records, a much simpler system. In fact, you can often access them online if they're filed federally through a system called PACER. That's an enormous advantage. You can track a court case, get an email when a new filing has come in, and get the document in your inbox in 30 seconds. It's amazing. And that system has been around since the 1980s. So this is like I'll stop talking now, but I think if we're talking about justice reform, we have to talk about access to the tools that are going to lead us to being able to push for that reform in the first place. And that's going to be access to information, be it through freedom of information legislation, or more importantly, through the courts themselves.
I know we're probably going to talk more about the access to information issues, but I feel like that there's like it's not just that that system itself is broken. There is just like it's like no one gives you any information. It's like file an FOI. You have to file the request. So like this summer, I was trying to report on vaccination in provincial jails. And I was trying to find out what's going on. This is not a hard question. They were like working on it. No information. And even throughout, like they started posting some numbers online instead of me having to like email every day and go, how many COVID cases are there in Ontario jails? Which I was doing every morning, because unlike CSC, the provincial system was not posting those numbers online. They started posting those numbers online, but they wouldn't post a number of jail guards who had COVID cases. So that's like another email. But the crazy thing was, every week they generated on Wednesday a memo that was sent out to Crowns to use in court that had all of this information on it. Here is the number of cases. Here's where they are. So I said, why don't you just send me the memo every Wednesday? Like, that's great. Instead of like someone having to email me that memo or like, whatever, get it from someone I know in court. No, it's like the memo doesn't exist. They wouldn't acknowledge the existence of this memo that was being used, has been used every week for the last 1.5 years. And like, that is just an example of how stupid this is. To get the information about like how vaccination was going on in prisons, I had to in provincial jails, I had to get someone to tell me when someone was going to testify in court about this, when the superintendent of Maplehurst was going to testify, when someone was going to be in court. That was the only way I could get that information. That was how I got the information, by like someone leaking, or by like someone telling me you might want to be here, or like, and how is this a workable system? And so it's like, it goes so far beyond access to information. It's like just any basic information that you want to get is so hard to get. And like, the other thing I'll just say is like, yes, like it's so great that the Star goes to court and we all go to court to like fight for things and fight for access and fight for openness. But like, the money and like the time that takes means we only do it in really specific cases. And so just very, very quickly, I will also talk about search warrants, which is like a hugely stupid area where like they're supposed to be open, but they're often routinely sealed, and then they're not unsealed. And then you can't know if they're sealed. So you can't know if the search warrant exists. So you're like, I know there was a search warrant, but like they can't tell you if it exists because it's sealed, and you can't see the sealing order. So you don't know why it was sealed. So like, we're all just like in this Kafkaesque like maze of nonsense all the time. And we only fight to get certain search warrants unsealed. And I know that because all the time I'm like, wouldn't it be great if I could get this search warrant? But it's actually going to take me like 6 weeks and a lot of money, and I just can't do it for this case. I just can't do it. And it sucks because I know that there's probably some really great information in there that would tell us a lot about our system. And anyway, yeah, talk forever.
Kafkaesque maze of nonsense is a pretty good, I think, overall descriptor of the system. And I mean, yeah, I mean, I'll just echo most of what you two are saying. You know, the reason things like the appeal can exist in the US, the reason you're able to have entire news outlets devoted to criminal justice is because you have access to the information. I mean, you know, that is a large reason why they have it there. We don't have it here. We do not have access in any systemic way to information about criminal trials, criminal prosecutions, or police investigations. Getting an ITO is next to impossible in this country in a way that it is almost immediately disclosable in the US. And it should be. I mean, you know, and you know, let's really think about what we're talking about. This is the information police rely upon to obtain search warrants, to obtain arrest warrants, to seize information, to request production from private companies. This is information that is in the public interest that, with some, you know, limited exceptions, should be disclosable to the public. We have a right to know how police obtain our information, search people's homes, and you know, find the grounds for an arrest. And fundamentally, that plugs into a massive problem that we rarely talk about in this country, which is basically wrongful arrests, wrongful convictions, and wrongful prosecutions. It is a system that is so opaque as to be downright secretive in this country. We have seen time and time again cases where there have been travesties of justice that, if this information had been disclosable from the outset, if it had been on the public record, if it had been sent to journalists, would have, you know, immediately obtained a massive amount of public scrutiny, but never did because it was done in such a secretive way. A colleague of mine, Tim Bousquet, has done a massive amount of work on the obscene travesty of justice that was a prosecution in Halifax of a guy named Glenn Assoon, which is now one of the, you know, the poster, you know, child of wrongful convictions in this country, a case where police ignored crucial evidence, you know, ignored you know, a mountain of mitigating circumstances, and that it got virtually no coverage because journalists didn't know about the details of the case. And this goes from, you know, from you know, the initial ITOs to the arrest to the trial. Even after conviction, a lot of the time you can't get these records, or at the very least you have to go through, you know, numerous hoops and trials just to try to get access. You know, even finding court listings in this country, even finding out when you know, a case is coming up before a judge can be difficult. Ontario has only recently digitized some of this, but it still is a patchwork system that is not always reliable. And if you try to go somewhere like PEI, Nova Scotia, Alberta, you know, good luck. You're often calling around, sometimes to different courthouses, just trying to figure out when somebody's appearing and how you might actually show up to cover the case. But this extends all the way to prisons. I mean, trying to communicate with federal inmates, never mind provincial inmates, is next to impossible. And it's done so as a matter of policy. Correctional Services Canada's stated policy, the policy that is on the books, is that journalists cannot speak to any federal inmate without first putting the request through Correctional Services Canada and getting it approved. They claim this is a protection of inmates' privacy, and that is so laughably, moronically, stupidly wrong that I have a lot of other words for it. But, you know, I spent a large part of 2020 speaking to federal inmates, and it actually was galling, the number of them who, you know, actually have really compelling stories to tell about how you know, their criminal trial was poorly done, how they had ineffective counsel, how serious matters of evidence were overlooked in their trial, and frankly, it would be next to impossible for me to know about any of that if they had not, you know, picked up the phone and called my cell phone, a thing that is actually illegal for them and could come with penalties, and in some cases has come with penalties. So our system works as a black box, and that is by design, it's by policy, it is by stated intent. And that black box makes it next to impossible for you to actually kind of surveil cases, for you to be on the lookout for cases of interest, for you to tell those stories, for you to find sources, for you to speak to people who have gone through this system. And with that, with this sort of policy in place, we can't have something like the appeal. We can't have the sort of consistent, sustained investigations that are necessary to underscore this to the public. And I'll just end by pointing to the Ashley Smith inquiry is a great example. I mean, here's a circumstance where we only fully understood the severity and depravity of our solitary confinement system because someone died, and we got an inquiry into it. The policies that killed Ashley Smith were being used systemically, and in many cases are still being used systemically. But the only reason it hit the public attention is because she died, because they killed her effectively. And it is really depressing to live in a system where people have to die for the public, for journalists to have access to this sort of information and alert the public about it.
I just wanted to, oh, sorry, please, Alicia.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add that, it might seem like we're all kind of going on a crazy tangent here by talking about, access to court records, access to information. I'm sure lawyers watching this are like, what the hell are they talking about? Like, it's fine. The thing is that, like Alicia said, one, news publications should never have to go to court, basically, to obtain anything, unless it's a complex matter, involving like family stuff, or I don't know. In almost every case that we've gone to court, it has been, in my mind, an exercise in, basically giving money to lawyers because it's been unnecessary. But, I think that part of the issue here is that lawyers have, again, this lawyers and judges and others have this unique access to the system that we simply don't have, right? I mean, they're the ones who are, if you're defending a client, you've seen the ITO because they had to serve it to you, right? They had to serve it to your client. We don't have access to any of that stuff. And it might seem like we're just belly aching here and, saying like, boo-hoo, the media wants more, better access or whatever, but it does have this important, foundational impact on our ability to report on this stuff. And there are probably, well, they're not probably, there are certainly human rights violations occurring in the courts and in prisons and jails every single day that we can't report on because we're not aware of them. We haven't been able to track them down yet. And, sometimes it feels like a minor miracle that I'm able to get a file that leads me to a story. And I think, Alicia and Justin would feel the same way, that sometimes, you go through this like tooth pulling exercise, and at the end you say, oh, finally we got it. Okay, well, it's now like 9 months later, this person no longer wants to talk to me. The topic, the zeitgeist has moved on from this topic. It's not as interesting or relevant to people. And it's very frustrating. In the United States, they don't have this problem, and it helps them do things that I only dream we could do in Canada, like holding judges accountable, holding prosecutors accountable. We talk a lot about, how crazy it is in the States that prosecutors and judges are often elected. But in Canada, we have a system where these people are appointed or just hired and basically escape all scrutiny, right? It's very rare that we ever see a judge written about in the Globe and Mail or written in the Toronto Star. And really, I think it should be the opposite. We should be talking about this every single day. Are there weird decisions that, are deserving of public scrutiny? I think there are probably decisions every single day that should be written about in that form, and not just the ones that end up at the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeal. Yeah. We should be talking about this every single day.
I have a tiny little vaguely positive story, and it's maybe the best time I've ever gotten records from a court, and it happened to be the Federal Court of Appeal. And it was a case that just got resolved. All of the accused pled guilty. It was a crazy mob case, and there was this absolutely just a mountain of evidence filed as part of the ITOs. And I remember I went to the court's clerk and I said, I'd like everything, like the case is resolved. I'd like everything ideally. And they said, well, you know what, come back in an hour. We'll see what we can do, which I'm like, okay, wow, an hour. Sure. I was expecting 3 weeks, an hour. Yeah, sure. I'll be back in an hour. I come back in an hour and they say, okay, well, it's all here. And they literally just point to just literally a pile of boxes of files. And I looked at it and I went, okay, this is a lot, but this is okay. This is better than usual. I open up, there are all these binders. I open up the front page of the binder, and on the front page of every single one is a CD with all of the ITOs on it. And I've never been so happy in my life to see a CD-ROM. This was 2017, which is, I mean, imagine putting on a flash drive or emailing it. No. CD, I was very happy to have a CD. But what was so bizarre about it is that I rip all of these PDFs. There's something like 3,000 pages, I think. And we're writing them up and we're going to publish, and there is a big disclosure on the front of every single one of these ITOs that says this information is covered by a publication ban. I cannot tell you how difficult it was to get a straight answer as to whether or not that publication ban was still in effect. We spoke to the Crown on both levels. We spoke to the Public Prosecution Service. We tried to speak to the court. We got every answer under the sun as to whether or not there was in fact a publication ban, to the point where the day we published the story, myself, my editor, our lawyer were just on an email chain going, well, I hope we don't go to jail, because we had no idea. We were basically just firing in the dark. And that sort of chilling effect leads to a ton of publications not publishing this information or heavily withholding it out of fear of being held in contempt of court, because there's just no consistency, clarity, or definitiveness, because we operate in a system that is secret by default and open only by application.
That I hope we don't go to jail feeling. My goodness, I can't count the number of times I felt that before I published a story saying, well, I don't know for sure, but we got to roll the dice at some point. No one can give us an answer.
Physical reaction to the word publication ban, just like Pavlovian over time. But I will just quickly say that one thing that really bothers me is, so we have this open court principle, which is great in theory, and there's lots of great case law that's coming from media organizations and challenging things. But one thing that I learned last year was that the parole board says the open court principle does not apply to them. So we have this system that from policing, and there's not issues of transparency around policing from the start, but from the ITO to the conclusion of a case, that stuff is all supposed to be open. And so we can go and say well, our system's not supposed to be like this, and be very righteous about it. But the rest of it is a complete, as Justin keeps saying, a black box. But it is impossible for me to understand how the parole system, which governs literally everything else that happens from the moment a judge says you are sentenced to 10 years in jail, can be so completely out of reach of all of these principles that we have for a reason. And I cannot understand the logic of it, and I cannot understand the reason for it, even if you're going to buy some of the inmate privacy arguments, which are very solvable, and often inmates themselves do not want this. I was denied a request to be in a provincial parole hearing that the inmate invited me to recently. I'm make it make sense. I don't understand. So, I mean, our system, there's just some really fundamental issues with the philosophies of our system too, that I think people think it's a misconception about the open court principle. It just doesn't apply in so many places, and it's a huge problem.
Thank you all for those really powerful points. And I think that one of the core takeaways for the legal profession, and as this event's hosted by the Law Society, is I feel like it is within their mandate and scope to address this kind of black box by design problem, right? We often see things coming out of the Canadian Judicial Council or the Law Society talking about, how much data is important and access to information is important. But this is kind of missing the elephant in the room, right? Which is that it is inaccessible by design. And if people take these principles seriously, there is a lot of major policy work and internal advocacy within the profession that has to be done. So I think that is a key takeaway from from our conversation today. Just as it's 10 o'clock now, I wanted to turn to some audience questions as well. So I just kind of compiling a couple questions together. We have someone from the John Howard Society of Canada who writes a blog and tries to kind of bring these issues to public attention. And they're interested in kind of opportunities to better work or collaborate with journalists. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Here, let me jump in. You know, I think what really drives great coverage is personal stories, and that's what we're always lacking when it comes to the criminal justice system. And for the thousands of reasons we've all talked about, it can be really, really hard to get a person on the phone who's inside a prison or going through the justice system. And I think helping connect those people with good stories to tell, with evidence of mistreatment or evidence of the failures of the system, connecting them with journalists can be a really powerful thing. Like I said at the start of the pandemic, well, actually before the pandemic even began, I was endeavoring to write a big piece about prisons for Maclean's, and the pandemic hit, and I suddenly I had given my cell phone number to a member of the Prison Legal Society at BC, and they just started giving out my number to any inmate who wanted it. And which in effect was great. It meant my phone was ringing literally all day, every day for weeks. I still occasionally get calls from inside federal and provincial prisons. And it's a rarity. Like, that is, I explain this to people, other journalists, colleagues who've been in this industry for a long time, and they're just gobsmacked. They don't know how to connect, because it is impossibly hard to connect with inmates in federal prisons, never mind provincial jails. More often than not, correctional services will tell you that it can't even tell you who's inside. They refuse to even confirm who's incarcerated, where they're incarcerated, how to get a hold of them. You can send a request, but it goes nowhere. I am convinced they often make a point of not passing it on. When you come back, they say, well, the inmate doesn't want to talk to you, so too bad. They've actually taken, they've penalized and taken retribution against inmates who have spoken ill of correctional services. We don't even know in most cases what sort of penalties they may be dishing out, because again, this system is a black box. And inmates are taking enormous risk by doing this, but it can be incredibly beneficial. It can be incredibly useful to underscore the ways in which solitary confinement is being used, the ways in which lockdowns are being used, the ways in which use of force are being overemployed. So I think fundamentally, if I say one single tactic that could be effective, it's just connecting people who are either going through the prison system or in the prison system or who have been released with journalists to help kind of underscore a lot of these problems.
I do think there's also like a space for like educating journalists. And I think that we could do a lot more to like teach people how to do some of these things that we've learned how to do. And maybe that's like a good way for collaboration to occur between these organizations, and also like not even just like the practicalities of it, but like understanding and like empathizing with like the experiences of people who have gone through something like this, because I think, and this is something that there is a history of in Canadian media of like not being sympathetic to these kinds of stories, or not trying to understand these kinds of stories. I get these emails, I'm sure you guys get these, but it's like, who cares about and like that, I don't think that's the prevailing perspective necessarily, but there is still a like, well, this person did a bad thing, so like we shouldn't care what happens to them. And if they're complaining about it, well, that sucks. But like, who cares? And so I think like there's a way to like help people who are journalists and think, that maybe if you think like that, maybe you shouldn't really be a journalist, but like, or like doing these kinds of stories. But like, I still think there's like a way to like help people understand how to write about drug use and like mental health and all of these kinds of things in a responsible and ethical way. And we could probably learn a lot from like people who work in these fields about how to do that and what to like look out for and what to be careful with. Because just the other thing that I learned from doing similar work to Justin is that a lot of the people calling me were in really vulnerable places. And when I was trying to meet up with some of them after they were released from provincial jail, I found that a couple of them either dropped off the face of the map or ended up in like very serious issues because of their ongoing mental health and substance use issues. and were not in a place where I could interview them or do the stories that we had talked about them, the stories they had wanted to tell. They were not in a place to do that and are still not in a place to do that. And like, that's just like, you have to learn how to understand those things and like how to, I don't know. I just think there's a lot we could learn from people who do this kind of work regularly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, you know, the third thing, if there's anything, is doing panels like this. It's having conversations where we try to, you know, perhaps push people who are involved in the justice system in a non-journalistic capacity to think a little bit differently, and ideally, you know, to email us. One of my favorite emails to get is from a reader who's an expert in something like this, like a lawyer, a parole officer, a guard, a policymaker, who says, "Oh, you're wrong in all of these ways, and here's why." Like, I think those emails are fantastic because they force me to shift my thinking. So, you know, as much as possible, I try not to work in an echo chamber or for an audience of myself. But it's you know, it's really hard when we're always the one doing the outreach. I think I appreciate being able to do things like this because it gives me an opportunity to structure my thoughts and learn from people like Alicia and Justin and Avery and others.
Yeah, and just briefly, the other direction too. I mean, you know, a lot of these cases journalists only find out about because some media savvy lawyer is willing to fire off an email and say, "I have this crazy case." You know, I've gotten a ton of stories this way. Just doing an interview about, you know, this, that, or the other thing, getting on the phone with a lawyer and having that lawyer go, "Oh, by the way, I have this case that is a total travesty of justice," and I go, "Yeah, I'd love to know more about that. Let's talk more about that." So, you know, actually being willing to pick up the phone or fire an email to a journalist and saying, "I have this really wild case you should know about," is a really, really effective thing.
Yes, do that. Definitely tell us about those things, because it's true that we don't know how to, not know how to, but it is impossible to find out what kinds of issues are happening in cases. Like all these charter applications that get brought all the time that are fascinating about police misconduct. It's impossible to find out about how many of those are happening and when they're happening and where they're happening if people aren't telling us about them. So tell us.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to address Denise's question from earlier in the event about you know, Indigenous communities and restorative justice principles. And Denise, I feel like we're really not able to do justice to that question, you know, in the time, and also, you know, with the participants that we have. We did invite Indigenous journalists to join. We weren't able to make that work out in the end for today. But I mean, I think that what I would encourage you to do is come to our next event tomorrow at 3. We're going to be talking about, you know, Indigenous justice alternatives to the criminal system in the context of bail reform. But if Tom and Justin Alicia wanted to, you know, to comment about restorative justice, I mean, I feel like you probably don't have a lot of positive things to say. But you know, well, if you, yeah. I'll just open the floor for a few comments.
Denise did mention Gladue reports, which I think is a topic I find incredibly interesting. And actually, the Globe has done some really, really good work in the last number of years on this. But you know, Gladue reporting is a system that I've done some writing on. It's a system that I think many lawyers, including Indigenous lawyers, would tell you is great in principle, but fundamentally broken, like many aspects of our justice system. It is a really progressive, thoughtful, restorative thing that's been allowed to slowly fall apart over a number of decades, not dissimilar to the access to information system. But I know that there is a movement afoot, including a couple of charter challenges going on right now that I cannot remember the name of, but to actually expand the Gladue system, potentially to actually add a sort of Gladue-like mechanism for all cases involving racialized accused. And I think there's a promise there of something that could be very, very important, which is a Gladue reporting system that is actually not rote, not sort of perfunctory or bureaucratic, but in fact actually kind of captures the actual situation and life experiences of those who are going through the criminal justice system. And if we can get to the sort of promise of what the Gladue report was supposed to be and actually give potentially the public some insight into what those reports are, I actually think they could go a long way in terms of relaying to the public the damage we're doing to many Indigenous communities by the over prosecution, the over incarceration of these people. And I think the Gladue report has a lot of promise in that respect, to understand the cycles of violence and the cycles of criminalization that exist. But as of right now, I don't think the reporting system does that. I don't think anyone would tell you that it's living up to its full potential. And I think it's a great topic of conversation that I wish, again, policymakers and public figures would actually engage with.
Thanks, Justin. Tom and Alicia, do you want to add any thoughts on this?
I would just say, I think required reading for anyone who's interested in systemic racism and the effects of systemic racism and fundamental inequalities in society and their impact on people's criminalization and incarceration, over prosecution, over policing. The Morris decision by Justice Nakatsuru, I think, is required reading. That kind of lays it all out. And I think the Court of Appeal said as much a couple weeks ago. That case might soon go to the Supreme Court. We'll see. That might, enhance Gladue to cover many more people than just Indigenous people. But reading that decision has definitely changed the way that I approach my stories. And I think it's important for anyone who's interested in this topic to kind of understand the scale to which these things should be considered.
Morris is the case I was thinking of, so thank you.
There's also a case in Nova Scotia called Anderson. There's also a very, very good decision that's actually viewed by a lot of people as more progressive than the Morris decision that came down from the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal, where these reports, they have many different names for them, but these reports specifically for Black Canadians originated. So I would also suggest reading that report or stories about those. It's Anderson and Morris are the two cases. But the Gladue specific problems also exist and this is a very, very short thing to say about this huge problem, but the problems that we find, it's a massive funding issue for one thing, funding, but by the time you're reading these reports, it's how are we stopping any of this from actually happening in the first place? And those are the more difficult questions. And so talking about things at the sentencing stage can feel a bit okay, well, we're here now. So but there's no, it's not preventative or forward thinking. It's all backwards thinking in a way, and how do we transfer all of the stuff that we learn about in those reports to actually doing stuff at the front end, so people aren't coming back into the system or aren't coming into the system in the first place. So it's all kind of tied together. They're not going to fix problems. They just tell us about the problems, and a lot of that stuff we already know. Most of it we already know.
Great. Well, thank you, Alicia, Justin, Tom. These are, I'm so glad we were able to convene this panel because I wanted to hear you guys speak about this. I was looking for somewhere, to show people or to see myself, what are the issues facing Canadian journalists. And I'm glad that we'll be able to put this to YouTube and link people to it. I think it will be a really concise way of summarizing a lot of these problems and pointing to kind of people the direction to what solutions are important and feasible. So we're just, it's 10:15, so we're just going to wrap up and conclude. So please follow all the panelists on social media. Tom, Justin, Alicia are all on Twitter, as well as they have their own Justin has your own website. Tom, Alicia, do you have websites as well? Or?
Yeah, tomcardoso.com.
Okay. And Alicia's at the Toronto Star.
I'm at the Toronto Star, no website.
Just Google it.
And I would also say, follow us at the Law Design Collab, the John Howard Society of Ontario, and Ben from the John Howard Society of Canada. Thank you for joining. Thank you all the participants for coming out, and a big thank you to the Law Society, specifically Nzinga, Wina, and Sheena, who made this event possible today. Really appreciate your support. Okay, wonderful. I hope to continue this conversation in different ways, in different forums. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See ya.